order. Call roll. Carl Kaminsky.
Present.
Larry Smith.
Here.
Tracy Van Bergen.
Here.
For the board, I'm here. Keelan Nealon.
Here.
Noonan. Sorry about that. Abigail
Here.
Wilburn. Ross.
Here.
How do I say your name?
Polarecki.
Hollerich. Okay. And Scott Ike.
Here.
Okay. And that's it. We're all present for a quorum. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes? Carl Kaminsky,
Second.
Larry Smith seconds. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Did we have any public comment? I don't think so. Any member comments? Okay. Okay, deliberate and update the wetland restoration fund in lieu of fee structure.
So if you guys remember, this was something that I had brought up last time to the committee about our fees. This spreadsheet that I put together here, these top portions here, we reached out to Lake County to figure out what their cost per acre is. So those are listed there for the 4 different watersheds where they have a restoration fund available. And then we also looked at the U.S. Army Corps banks that are available. So there's 2 here in McHenry, one for the Kishwaukee River watershed, one for the Nippersink Creek. And then just for comparison, again, they have one in Kane County, or 2 here with the Muirhead Springs and the Prairie Green, and then 2 in Lake County. And I believe we weren't able to track down a number for the 2 in the Kane and 1 for the Mill Creek, but the one for Lake County there, Des Plaines River watershed, that's the value that had come in. So what I tried to do next was give the old fees. So these were actually, I found the original date of when this was created. So these numbers here that we've had have been in place since May 27th of 2010. As part of our coordination, Lake County basically told us that they went with the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, their inflation calculator, which is just a simple tool. You enter in the value and the year, and then you can spit out a value for a current day, etc. So for a comparison, I took these numbers that we had, and that's what I did, and that's what you're going to see in the second table here that says adjusted for inflation for that CPI calculator. So for comparison, I highlighted the Nippersink Creek values to show them against what the U.S. Army Corps is charging for the same watershed. And then I did highlight in yellow the Kishwaukee River watershed to highlight against the Army Corps and what they're charging in that watershed. And so what we're seeing is that even if we adjust some of these numbers here, we can see that except for the Fox, really, the range of values with the adjustment is still a little bit lower than what we're seeing in the other places. So that was the analysis that we ran, short of potentially, doing an in-depth analysis with maybe a wetland consultant to get new restoration cost values, and maybe with the assessors to update these land cost values. This is the available data if we wanted to make a decision based off this or potentially investigate further.
Okay, let's start with some discussion. Anybody questions? Because I've got a couple. How many available acres are there in the wetlands? I know we were
Well, for the banks, I don't know that we asked that question. Like for example, how much are in each bank? I'd probably have to go back and and verify those numbers, and also verify potentially, if you wanted to know how much they started out with. Did they start out with 50 acres, 100 acres, how much has been used up? We can get some of those statistics.
I know transportation had been talking about the possibility that in the future we may be short of wetlands bank acres to purchase. So that's why I asked that question,
Okay.
to figure that out.
Okay, I can definitely look at those statistics, and I don't know, because
And
I had.
any possibly coming online.
Okay. Because I don't know for these banks, for some of the, for the Army Corps ones at least in here, I have to check and see if they provide how much availability they have, or if it's just you inquire. And if we inquire, we have the context there, we can just reach out to these folks and confirm.
If we vote on this today, it moves forward to P&E, I believe.
I suspect, yeah.
And then it could take effective date of the county board meeting? When does this take effect if we vote on this?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as it's approved, we can update the numbers. I don't know, just for clarification, I don't know that there's, at least to my knowledge, anything that's hanging out there at the moment, like in terms of wetland mitigation, unless DOT has some projects that they know of, that potentially, we would need to do it as soon as possible, but obviously,
I'm assuming we already took care of the Randall Road mitigation.
I'd have to talk to DOT.
Oh, that's in that.
Yeah.
Itself, I think. Carl, you got a question?
Yeah. On here where you have, lower Fox, upper Fox, Nipperson, we may have gotten it or may not, but do you have basically a map that shows the area of acreage that you're referring to here on this chart? I may have seen it, you sent it out, I'm not sure.
I don't know that I have a map for potentially these.
Or something that's
watersheds.
showing those areas that you're referring to. Not right now, but you can email it when you get it.
Okay.
Yeah, you can send that out to everyone.
This could possibly go for next week, right?
If we approve it here this morning. Could go for the September meeting.
So I have this map,
Well, you could put an effective date on it.
which for visual, this is essentially going to be Nippersink, number 5. With probably number 3 being the Kish, and then 8 and 2, I imagine this is probably Upper Fox, Lower Fox. So
Okay.
I need to confirm those because this is a little bit different, but.
Yeah, later, not right now to take
Yeah,
up.
just real quick off the
Yeah.
cusp of what I have, that's kind of the visual representation for these areas. Now, if it's more appropriate for these different boundaries in the watershed, we can take a look at that. And you know what? We do actually have, I'll pull it up on our website. Should have this on our website. So let me get that. Loads for me. So, yeah, so there's the map. So basically, Upper Fox, like we said, so if I compare it to the colors, just a little bit easier on the eye, number 8 is your Upper Fox, 2 is the lower. And then you have 3 is Kishwaukee, 5 is the Nippersink. What else do we have here? East Nippersink up here, and then the Piscasaw is up here, and then Coon Creek, so basically Piscasaw number 7, Coon Creek number 1. So this is except for these that has, this would be west and east. Everything else is pretty much color coded. So these are, I don't have the acreage on these, but I can get those.
That's fine, at a later time.
Okay.
Don't need to take up meeting time.
Yeah, I think the question more is how many acres are available? You know, what they started with and how many have been purchased already, can't sell them twice.
Yeah, and that could, continue to change. We have had inquiries where potentially there are organizations looking to establish new banks in the areas they do their research for demand and supply. So.
Right, okay. So, any other questions, comments?
Yeah, so what's the negative impact of this? The pros and cons of raising this? I mean, there's gotta be some kind of consequence if we raise it. Do we put somebody out of business, or?
Well,
If the project's that much more expensive?
I think there's 2 key factors here. Number 1 would be, this would fund a project. So if there's a development that's requiring mitigation and we went off with potentially lower numbers, then when they go to actually construct the project and implement it, then we might run out of money when we say, here's a pot of money and we get all these different bids in. And from that perspective, when projects are coming into us for that bidding process, we may not, they might look at it and say, well, that's too little money for what we need to do, like the values could be off. So that's the first potential issue. The other issue is that it could discourage Army Corps or other organizations from opening up banks if we're offering lower costs, because the incentive would not be there for these other organizations to make an investment in McHenry County. So I think those are the 2 main components that we would probably need to consider, is making sure that the fee in lieu, the cost per acre is adequate, that it can actually fund projects, and that we're not lowballing anyone to potentially discourage other organizations or entities to come in and make investments into the county as well. So I don't think we need to be spot on, but in the ballpark to potentially satisfy those 2. I think those would be the two biggest factors there.
I think it's important we update these dollar amounts. I mean, from 2010 to now, I think it's real important. So, the other thing, it's your point about possibly discouraging people from developing more bank for us. We're gonna run out of it. There's only so much out there with all the road projects and different projects in construction and building. There's a lot of building going on. So, okay, last question before I'll ask if you guys want to vote on this is lost my train of thought. I should have wrote it down.
Sorry.
Never mind. Okay. If everybody's okay, I'll call for a motion to approve this.
Just, can I ask a clarification? Are you looking to approve the numbers that I gave for the CPI table?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you?
The higher numbers. The number on the bottom, that's your CPI with inflation.
Yes.
Is there a discussion if anybody wants to change that or raise that, lower it?
Because the only thing that I don't know, again, is those land costs and restoration costs from 2010. I don't know the factors that went into that.
Well, you haven't figured that in there.
Well, that was from 2010. I don't have any records of, like, the land cost, was that working with the assessors to factor that in? And the restoration costs, I don't know the factors that went into that. So the updated CPI calculator, that's just a similar strategy that Lake County used to update their older numbers. So we would, have to take into consideration that the 2010 values were good at that time, because that's all it is just a straight inflation adjustment.
Excuse me.
And the purpose of this was just to give you an idea what that looks like, but then also comparatively what Lake County is looking at. And again, looking at the two US Army Corps banks, for the two highlighted numbers, we are still coming in under those values by 40,000. So that's why I just want to clarify when when
What's
you guys-
everybody think? You wanna have figured some land in there? If you're looking at the land values that they have there?
I guess how would you figure that out?
Well, I think this would be, these land costs per acre, that would probably be something where I would work with the assessors.
And just use,
And see if, just approach the townships and our assessor and say for these different areas, these adjusted land costs per inflation from these values, do they fall in line with what your expectation would be currently? So we did not gather that input. We wanted to just see how you guys felt before we, broached that subject.
Well, I think, I agree with you, Jim, that it needs to be raised, but if there's some question about whether that is accurate information that you're using, that maybe we should wait.
Right. I think everyone's in kind of agreement on that at this point after you brought that up.
So, because what I heard from you is you didn't go in depth into those values because you weren't sure we were gonna wanna raise it or not anyway.
It was more of, here's what the data is, and just a raw transformation of the 2010 data. But I could not find documentation or any type of summary indicating how the values from the 2010 tables were formulated. So I do want to preface that is a big...
Blind trust?
Yes.
We accept those numbers or we don't.
Right, so that's the only component that I would pose to the committee, is that if you wanted to trust these numbers, then here's the adjusted values, using the same technique that Lake County did. And that's why I wanted to highlight these differences here as potentially a little bit of a red flag, because of just we're off a little bit there. But there could be other factors in play, so just prefacing that.
I think it's probably important to have some sort of justification as to how we got the numbers in case somebody challenges it, other than we just trusted numbers from
I would
2010.
agree with you on that.
Yeah, that's a good thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if somebody challenges it, you can say, here, this is how we figured it out, but
I could.
right now we can't say that.
I can definitely agree on that. So let's put you to that
Okay.
project and find that, and then we'll bring that up definitely on the agenda for next time to bring it up.
Okay, and what I'll do is I'll just give you guys an additional table with those results. So then you'll have basically all the data in comparison.
That was my question. What's our current balance on that?
I think
11,881.
11.
11,000?
Oh, yeah, budget season, 11,881.
Because when it reaches 75,000, I believe, we have to act on it. Okay.
Yeah. I was gonna say around 15, but And we did try to look at like Kane and other areas, but us and Lake are the only two counties that do this restoration fund. The other counties, when they do their mitigation, they get a cost estimate for the project at that time. Where this is a little bit different, where we collect the money per acre and then potentially down the road bid it out.
Okay.
Just for a clarification, but I'll go ahead and get those costs. And we'll get land costs, we'll work with the experts on the land costs, and then we'll try to reach out to some folks for restoration costs. And I'll give you guys those values based on those experts.
Okay. All right, let's move on to discussion items. 6.1, conflict between maintenance of drainage ditches involving dredging and general permit for dredging.
Yes, bear with me here. I tried to include kind of a walkthrough process on part of this issue, and related to this conflict, we also discovered an additional one on Tuesday along the same lines. So I can also share that with you because it's the same idea. So what was brought up was essentially the ordinance lists a set of exempted activities with a broad kind of category of other maintenance activities. So as we follow that and go to the definition of other maintenance activities, we come to, and actually G and H is included as part of this, and I'll highlight that, but we come to this maintenance of drainage ditches, which allows an owner to dredge, remove obstruction, dead vegetation that's outside of designated floodway, provided that the spoil material is removed from flood hazard areas, spread thinly, and incorporated into existing cultivated areas, or it's just removed from the site. They still need to provide sediment erosion control, and this does not include straightening of an existing ditch, widening it, filling, or any of those type of activities. So it is just a maintenance component. So per those definitions, we do come to our general permit category for permits. So this applies to any regulated development within flood hazard area. And that's the first trigger. So one of those items is dredging. And in the definition, it indicates that this applies to dredging of channels and ponds. And if we look at this, a lot of the language is very similar to what was highlighted in the maintenance components. So essentially that you're trying to reestablish the existing conditions, you're not straightening, widening, spoiled materials are spread thinly, not located outside the flood hazard area. So essentially, when we looked at these two components, a lot of the language was the same. The main difference that we noticed was that in the general permit, it discusses that this is for a channel. And if I go up to the maintenance one, it says ditch. And during TAC, both channel nor ditch has a definition, but the similarities are, people use them interchangeably all the time. So, and also, as I highlighted, I didn't highlight here, but H, I talked about ponds. So again, you have this maintenance component to a pond, again, spread thinly or hauled away, erosion control, all of those. And if I come back to this dredging permit, it has ponds. So this creates this question of, is it maintenance or is it a permit? And part of the discussions that we had intact was kind of two thought processes of either we keep the general permits and waive the fees, was kind of the thought process for dredging, or it's eliminated as a general permit and the maintenance definitions are revised to make sure that everything is captured from that perspective. There was no real consensus on which option people liked. The main point that came up though was that in an effort when there's dredging happening, we definitely want to make sure that the spoil piles are put in a location that is adequate. It doesn't remain in the flood hazard area. And with a general permit, since we do require a site plan, we do get that, because then we can comment on, hey, you're still in the site plan where you want to put your spoil area. Under the maintenance consideration, that would be up to the owner of the property to make that judgment. And if they're wrong, then we would potentially come out for an inspection, or someone calls it in and say, well, yes, you were doing maintenance, all of that is fine, but where you put your stockpile material is still in the floodplain. And some of that, obviously with the floodplain maps that we have and everything, you know, people do have access to that information, but the confidence that everybody is gonna be able to adequately assess that and make sure that they're putting it outside of the flood hazard area, that was the main sticking point behind not wanting to move it potentially to an exclusive maintenance activity, or have some kind of consultation with staff as part of that. And I just want to point out one other one where it's kind of a similar idea. I have the SMO here, so let me just, because it's the same idea, but like I said, it came up recently. We have the maintenance of existing roads and bridges. So again, this is under the general permit one, same thing with the dredging, where basically rehabilitative maintenance gives an example such as milling and overlay, does not increase the impervious area and does not increase the surface elevation. There is this interesting section here where it talks about maintenance. For that, resurfacing and just some other details, that this portion here, if I go to the definition here, it's the same language. And that same language again shows up under the exempted area right here. So again, we have this definition for, hey, you can do maintenance for your existing roads and bridges as long as you follow this criteria, but then we go and we say, well, you need a general permit for it actually. And again, the verbiage and the wording is the same.
So what's your thoughts here, your own thoughts?
Well, these, I guess to treat them differently, the dredging one, in terms of, you know, how I view it, I think that one is really straightforward, and the only drawback is just making sure that that spoil material is handled properly. And you know, I will say that Army Corps and IDNR went to this system of having requirements and posing those requirements as a self-issuing system where they're putting the onus on those property owners, saying, if you follow these instructions, you don't need a permit, you don't even need to talk to us, type of thing. My only fear to that is people actually implementing it correctly. And I don't want to put someone in violation because they weren't sure, they thought they were reading the map correctly, and there could be a technicality to that. Now,
What was the tech committees, I actually missed the last one.
they were kind of split, that no one really, they wanted to kind of, it seemed like, I want to say that probably the slight majority wanted to leave the general permits, but remove the fees for dredging and, I guess in this case, maintenance of existing roads and trails would fall in that category. Kind of make it a free permit, if you will, for those two specifically, because not all these general permits fall within this conflict or this dilemma.
Anyone bring up about the half mile per permit?
Yes, that was brought up, and that is referencing the Army Corps IDNR requirements. So a lot of these general permits, the idea is, what does Army Corps say, what does IDNR say? We're gonna do the same thing. We're just gonna pluck and pull those same requirements and put them into these general permits.
So if they do a maintenance project on a drainage ditch or whatever you want to call it, I call them ditches. If they do a maintenance on that, where I know years ago down by Huntley, they did the Kishwaukee and that was miles long. And they did it all at the same time. Does that mean every half mile they have to have a separate permit?
If we were to look at this, that would mean that they wouldn't qualify for a general permit. We'd probably bump them up to a major development for a longer stretch of project area.
Even though it's considered maintenance?
Well, that's where this conflict is where do I consider it maintenance and exempt the project, or do I have to consider it as a major development? And what we would look at is potentially the details of that. We'd want to make sure that every aspect is maintenance related. So if any portion of the project would go outside of that scope, I think the way we would generally approach it upon kind of initial discussion among staff is to exempt the portions that are maintenance and issue a separate permit for the area that is not, to capture that more accurately, because we don't want to say 99% of what you're doing is maintenance. This 1% is gonna kick you into a major development. You're gonna need to get engineers, you're gonna need to go to IEPA. They still might need to do that for the amount of earthwork they're moving, et cetera, but we wouldn't look at it as.
What would the Army Corps do in that case?
The Army Corps would look at it as if you're meeting, they call it their nationwide permits, which are intended for this purpose. And like I said, I can't remember if the half mile requirement's coming from their end or IDNR, but if you're doing it longer than a half mile, then they'll probably end up issuing some kind of permit, but I haven't spoken to the representatives about that. But they seem to be fairly hands-off if they can when it comes to these type of projects and related to their nationwide. So their nationwide permits are our equivalents to our general permits. It's just they look at it as you don't need to come in and talk to us and explain your project. Here's a list of the nationwides. If you feel like you meet one, have at it, essentially.
Well, I personally don't want to put up any more roadblocks for people maintaining their ditches or channels or, whatever we're talking about. I mean, this year we've had record rainfall, and the flooding because of the lack of maintenance in a lot of ditches has caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. I would like to see us follow whatever Army Corps stipulates or IDNR. I mean, who are we talking about? The people that are doing the maintenance? Are we talking about farmers? There are farmers that do hire people to do this who are very knowledgeable. You know, so that for the most part, I'm okay with putting it on the landowner to make that decision with the spoils. And if there's a problem with the spoils, then, you know, we step in.
Is there a history of problems, like within your department, the violations
Well,
related to this?
sometimes there can be, because, and it's a combination of private landowners that have ponds or creeks and streams, so we do see both agricultural and private ownership that come in with this. Sometimes it is difficult if we're not aware of the project. As part of this, we do go out to take some pictures to just check those elevations and those components to have a before and after. And sometimes we run into problems, especially along rivers and mostly from private owners, but sometimes from ag community folks too, where there is potential work brought in and the complaint is that there's fill been brought in. We can see that there's some type of disturbance, but we don't have a good way of quantifying whether or not it's a topsoil restoration due to the erosion or someone's filling in low spots. And that becomes extremely difficult for us. And if we lack the evidence, it almost makes it impossible to seek enforcement, because if it comes down to a battle in court, if we don't have the evidence, then we know we're gonna lose that one, so we don't even spend the resources. We do have some contour mapping and things like that, where we can try to, you know, take a look at what the existing was and try to figure that out, look at, you know, how it lines up with the existing ground elevations, if we can see there's a little bit. And, you know, folks generally try to work with us and say, yeah, I brought in fill and that sort. But that's the issue that we could face, that if we do get a call and we come in afterwards, it's going to be really high to quantify the area, figure out where it was deposited and if it was indeed filling the floodplain. Because one example could be, yes, I filled, but I only filled a couple of inches, where in reality, maybe they did 6 inches. And so we wouldn't have any way to make a distinction one way or the other with that thin of margins.
Well, the way I read this with the dredging and the general permit versus maintenance is, I think it's very clear that the maintenance, since it excludes floodway, it would be everything outside of the channel itself, or the flow line. So maintenance would be one thing, but the permit would be if you're actually trying to restore that flow line or the channel itself. So I can see that they're very, very separate distinction there. Plus, the definition of open channel covers ditches, channels, it throws everything in one.
Yeah, let me, just to show you guys. And again, maybe this is a challenge to find better definition, but in the definition of channel, ditch is in there. So it's just too much of a similarity to where it's causing headache, and I can definitely see that. And if someone on their own is trying to make that distinction, and also it's difficult because the floodway is another component of the floodplain, and not everybody is going to understand that concept, and they're just going to think my flood area is this wide or whatever it is. So like I said, I don't know if it's potentially trying to provide more clarification. At this point, I think the TAC kind of wanted to see where the committee was at to try to then dive into one option versus the other. I just had too much chatter. I couldn't make headway one way or the other, and so I said, okay guys, let's move this along, let me bring it up to committee see maybe which way they're leaning. And if they are not, then I can go back and we can dive deeper into it with, again, your feedback to give you a better analysis or maybe what each option might look like, if there's a preference.
Larry?
Well, I want to agree with Tracy about not having any roadblocks so they can get this work done if they need to. But when you're talking about the general permit and getting some type of site plan, I think that's important, because anytime we have anything where we have to go back out and try to correct something that didn't get done, is always a battle. And I feel that puts you guys in a bad spot. So if you have a site plan to start with and you got something to refer to, as opposed to going out there and expressing your opinion and arguing with the person, is it a reasonable thought, or?
Yeah, 100%. And part of the problem is with site plans, if we don't have anything on file that's not official as well, we run into problems where there's maybe 2 or 3 versions of the site plan. And so if there's nothing official that was submitted to us, then that becomes a challenge too.
But if you get the permit, they have to.
Yeah, but then we stamp the official site plan. So in that case, we give it back to them and say, here's your permit. Now it's their responsibility to look over that documentation. If they look at the permit that was approved and they find an issue with it, that gives them an ability to address that. But we are very upfront with the idea that making sure that this is the final thing that you want. Once we stamp it, that's what you're moving forward with. If you want to make changes, come to us sooner rather than later, so you don't potentially have to deal with modification fees or get yourself into trouble later. So that would generate an official site plan to go off of, that both parties would basically agree to, because once we give you the permit, you take it and you start working off of it, then that's kind of, it should have brought, if you notice that there's an issue, should have been brought up right away, that potentially we issued the wrong site plan or there's miscommunication.
Well, like I said, to go out after the fact and try to straighten it out is always an issue, so.
Are drainage districts maybe exempt from?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So from a fee perspective, that's where I think, like, if I had to give you guys an idea of where my preference and where TAC would be, is that we would like to have some kind of procedure where we do get a site plan and have some type of review process, just to make sure that they're also not straightening a ditch or widening a ditch, or that we're aware of it. And if we are getting phone calls, at least we can put other neighbors at ease that it has been reviewed. But obviously with it being in maintenance, there's a fee association with that potentially for these 2 examples, maybe that's waived, or maybe the process is done in a way where we can have people come in for a counter review or an email exchange that becomes official. So maybe it's not a permit, but something in between, like a pre-application meeting or a consultation or something to that effect.
Is maintenance considered pulling it back to the original engineering? And of course, some of these projects done 100 years ago. I know I saw in a box, the drainage districts have everything in a box, and they pass it from member to member to member. And that's why we've been trying to gather it here at the county. And I saw in the box from Coon Creek Drainage District, they literally did have all the original engineering of that entire project. They had all of that. So that leads me to the question of original engineering is they made those straight. For the last 100 years, they're winding and everything. When the trees fill in, no maintenance of them, and all of a sudden the creek is winding. You're saying to go back to original maintenance, they can't straighten that? But if they're exempt, I guess that changes that.
So yeah, I think that's where we work with every landowner to try to establish what those existing conditions looked like. Typically, we try to go back to when the ordinance went into effect as kind of a pre and post, is kind of the first kind of hallmark to check. That's kind of where our aerials drop off anyway. Anything after that is grainy black and white mostly to try to make a, distinction from it. Now, if they have original documents and pictures that provide that history, then we would be amenable to reviewing that and taking that into consideration. And probably what I would say from that perspective, depending on how that channel or ditch is viewed, if it's potentially an IDNR, an Army Corps jurisdiction, I would feel more comfortable telling them that that operation would be, have to be reviewed by those entities. And I think what we would do actually is, because the maintenance has been lacking for, let's just throw 100 years on it, at that point, I think we would no longer consider it maintenance, but allow them to restore it back to that original condition, because it is gonna involve grading and activities that would fall outside of maintenance. So I think that it wouldn't be a maintenance, I think they would need a permit, but they can establish that, well, it was like this 100 years ago. Now we wanna go back. We've lacked the maintenance, we've lacked the funding, life happens, et cetera, however many years that is, then we can have that discussion. I don't know that we wouldn't review that as well to see if potentially there's a flooding concern, or if there's a known flooding issue in the area, that the, more of the meandering provides a better benefit. There's a lot of factors there. It's not, the stormwater's never black and white, but that's kind of, I think, the process that I would look at in trying to make that determination is, does some of your activity fall outside of more of what maintenance, what we would consider maintenance, and then try to establish, is it okay to go back to that condition that was established 100 years ago? Because we have to remember that there's probably development that's happened around the area that was factoring the newer change as opposed to the older, more straightened version. And that's another factor that goes into it that it would be hard to answer.
So tech is also looking at reviewing this, they're going back to this again?
I am gonna have them go back to it, but the discussion that came out of that was, well, we kind of had two ideas floated around. Can we bring it up to the committee to see, one, do they like both, do they not like both, or is there an overwhelming majority from this committee that prefers one over the other? And getting some of that feedback and details to go back to TAC and vet it more thoroughly, and look at it. I will say, from a definition perspective, nobody really liked the idea of trying to provide definitions between channel and dredging, or the two processes. They felt that it was very similar. And although on a technical level, potentially more engineer-minded folks might be able to get the difference, we want to have this be as simple as possible for everyone to use.
What's the range of fees for a general permit for maintenance?
Well, if it's an exempted activity under the maintenance clause of the SMO, there's no fees because it's an exempted activity.
But under the general permit?
The general permits are all a straight $250 permit. There's no difference between one general permit or the other. And what we also do is, if a property has multiple projects, seawall, dredging, boat pier, whatever else, we'll do one $250 permit, but cover multiple of those activities. So we don't charge, $250 for each type of activity that you're doing. It's $250. So I always tell people, if you've got, you want to dredge and then you want to do a seawall, or you want to do, something along those lines, let's get you a permit for all of them. If you don't happen to get to one because of timing and finances, or you don't want to do it, that's a different story. That's fine, we can do an inspection and indicate that you chose not to do this particular component. But at least that way it covers 4 different activities under one $250 fee.
Carl?
Kind of a question, going back to what Mr. Kern said, that you had a permit that was only for a half mile, and if it was, you know, a long, greater distance, you would bump it up. What's to stop a person from saying, okay, here's a permit for a half mile, that's free, here's another one for a half mile, and it's continuing on that one without having to elevate it to the next level like you had mentioned?
Right, not much. We do have a term for that called phasing, where potentially even just outside of that, let's say you're gonna do 4 greenhouses, and if you do 1 greenhouse at a time, you're gonna be exempt for each one. But if you do all of them together, you would need a permit. We do have folks that come in and say, well, I wanna do 4 or 5, but right now I only have the money for 1. So because of that, we usually lean towards, okay, we'll exempt this one, and it's gonna need an ag exempt permit, but if we go out there and find that maybe 2 or 3 have been built within that time period, then we generally say you need a permit. So what we advise people is to do that project, complete it, totally stabilize it, and then potentially move to the next one if they have the financial means available. But
I would think if
it's
there were
difficult.
different landowners, you could issue a permit for each landowner.
If it comes to that, yes. Sometimes we have projects where potentially it's multiple entities, and as long as the one owner is okay with the work, then this comes up sometimes in restoration work, or when, like, take MCCD for example, they get a lot of public funding, but they work with private owners and things like that for restoration projects, maintenance along this same line. We usually advise them to have MCCD as the applicant because they're gonna get that exemption, and just have some kind of notarized letter that those other owners are approving it, because we wanna try to extend their dollars as much as possible. In that case, we would grant 1 permit for the project with those affidavit letters kind of behind it. We try to make it as simple as possible, trying to have, let's say it's 4 properties, having 4 separate permits and it's the same work, it just makes things complicated for everyone involved. So if we can simplify it, we would prefer to do that. And to your point, Carl, you know, if a person comes out and says, I'd like to eventually do 5 miles, but I don't know where my fundings come from. You know, if we give them, the other thing is if we do give them a permit, or say, well, you need a permit for that and it's only good for 2 years, then, you know, we try to take that into consideration, maybe the time frame, and use all those factors to figure out what makes sense. We certainly, to Tracy's point, we don't want to make it more cumbersome and complicated than it already has to be. But we do want to have some, you know, level of just involvement, I'll say.
What's the length of time when generally on these dredging permits?
2 years.
No, what's the length of time to issue that permit usually from average? I know you don't have that many of them probably.
If they have everything, all the documentation, the plan looks great, we might be able to issue it next day from time of application.
Okay.
It just takes, the time is just to review it, put the paperwork together, put the conditions together, stamp everything. And generally speaking, that's not something that we have someone just sitting around looking for something to do.
The reason I asked that was if you get somebody pulls in this longer than a half-mile project, all the equipment's there, they're pulling that in. I mean, that's part of the economics of it too. So that's the only reason I asked that question.
Generally speaking, they're fairly quick permits. The only time they're not is when it's a bad site plan, which anytime you have a bad submittal, it's just gonna take a little bit to work with that owner.
Which would, to Larry, having the permit actually issued, even if they didn't make any charges, would make sense to prevent any of that problem. That's what you were getting at, right, Larry?
Pardon, I'm sorry, I'm reading this.
You were getting at that, about the permits, having the permits, even if you didn't charge for them.
Yeah,
Just so that they had the site plan to prevent those problems.
the site plan, some type of control device, yeah.
Carl?
When you talked about basically a 24-hour turnaround, you're doing like what Adam says, being more automated, that you're doing it emailing wise instead of walking in with permit and paper.
Depends what the applicant wants to do. If they come in with hard paper copies and do a submittal, and they're like, I wanna come back and pick it up, then, we'll do that. If they want it mailed, we'll throw the stamps on there, throw it in the mail for them, send them an alert that it's in the mail. Sometimes you're like, okay, that's good, I'm just trying to get my ducks in a row, and so I'm not gonna get started yet, that's fine. Otherwise, sometimes we can just send them a PDF copy of that permit, it's in the mail, so if they wanna, get working, they have that confidence that everything is good to go.
Okay. Anybody else on this? Let's see what a general consensus, what's everyone think we should do? Take this back, have them come up with a little bit of an idea of what they're thinking they should change.
I think you could leave the language the same. I mean, I don't see anything contradictory between the permit and the maintenance, the exempted maintenance, and the definition that's listed here. I think everything's pretty clear. I think doing away with the fee for the maintenance for dredging, I think that would make sense.
Right now, they don't apply for anything that falls under maintenance, right? It's exempted, they don't need to contact it. So that's where the issue is. So I guess, do we make some sort of application process for maintenance and not charging? So that this department can review the maintenance, and then if it's determined that it's outside of the maintenance, we go to the general permit.
See, I don't know if I agree on the maintenance side of it. Larry, is that what your intent on the maintenance side though? Or were you talking about the actual, of when you go beyond maintenance?
I would say my intent would be beyond maintenance, but with the definitions the way they are written, maintenance can be an issue too, because then you're starting to dig all the silt out of the ditches, is it? So.
Well, if you're digging it out of the bottom of the ditch, that would require the general permit. If you're leaving everything in the channel itself and just taking out the deadfall and taking out the undesirable trees, that's the definition of maintenance as exempted.
There's a different definition to that with the Army Corps. Maintenance is back to the original engineering.
I would disagree on that because in here, other maintenance activity talks about you cannot change the channel, you cannot reconfigure it. So maintenance as defined here is removal of the dead, dying vegetation and dredging, but that would be taking it outside of the regulatory floodway or the designated floodway, which would be a zone AE on the FEMA maps, because you've got the definition of non-designated floodway, which would cover your typical zone A's.
So just for coverage of floodway, designated floodway means that IDNR has mapped it. It's on a map, they've designated it. Non-designated is 100 acres or more tributary that is flowing to that location or any location. Take a cross section at any location of a creek or channel, ditch, etc. If you can show that there's 100 acres tributary to that, then that would be a non-designated floodway. And that's not gonna show up on the maps. So generally speaking, if it's FEMA floodplain, whether it's zone A or zone AE, you're probably gonna be dealing with floodway, whether it's designated or not. This is just saying that in designated floodways, if it's showing up on the map, the maintenance is not covered. It's not a maintenance activity because you're in the floodway and you basically have to go talk to IDNR. And then for that would be really in here, the only kicker for this definition that then would say you need to get a general permit as well as part of that. But yeah, I can pull up the definition of dredging as well if you want to take a look at that. But, you know, Mr. Wilkie, working with a lot of farmers, does indicate that this is not something straightforward for him as well. So just giving another point of view, the concern from the TAC is that, is this gonna be easy enough for everyone to follow? And when TAC was like, well, it looks like we're falling on the idea that this says maintenance of drainage ditches, the GP1 says maintenance of channels. Also, you have the dredging of ponds, which is very similar to the GP1, so ponds, that's the same. And then when you go to the definition of channel, ditch shows up in there as well. So that was the concern, is that it's not gonna be clear for everyone to be able to follow it cleanly.
I can see that, but it sounds like this is something they ought to deal with. I mean, that's why there's the technical advisory committee.
So they were leaning towards the idea of keeping the general permits, revising the maintenance, and potentially removing some of this maintenance to have people come in and have those be a 0-fee general permit.
When's their next meeting?
Well, I will be gone in August for that one, so September would be the next TAC meeting, and then MCSC is obviously, the next one is September as well. So they will be able to meet prior to you, at least one time. Now we can, even if I'm not here, I'll talk to Adam to see if we want to have him step in and run that, if there's a need for that.
He's easier than you.
So, but I will be gone for that portion of August. But if I had to generalize, the way that they wanted to proceed was have it more of a general permit, but make it free so that there is that review process, and change the maintenance language so that it's either clear or it's removed, since it's very similar, and then that way the only cumbersome process is really just asking folks to come in with the site plan so that we can give them a yes or no type of thing. The other,
An engineered site plan?
no, the general permits don't require an engineer, only if the project involves a larger than 20,000 square feet area. So if you're generating enough spoils where then you want to do some berming, you want to do some other stuff, again, going beyond the scope, then potentially, even then, we don't necessarily need that engineer unless it gets over to about that half-acre mark, more or less. So if I had to characterize a preference from them, it was going that route. Keeping the general permits, revising some of the maintenance definition or the overlap, or removing it altogether and making those permits free, essentially.
What is the code definition of dredging?
The maintenance or restoration of a water body by removing accumulated silt, sediment, and other debris from its bed.
I think if you want a common sense maintenance, exempt, take dredging out and just leave it for removal of vegetation and obstructions, because that's 90% of the problem with the channels and what people are going to want to do. From farmers, they're going to want to get rid of the deadfall, going to want to get rid of anything that's flowed down there and pull it out. You just let them do that, fully exempt, and only if they're moving earth and material, then
Or if you're a drainage district.
The problem is
Drainage.
also is vegetation, trees and everything. You have two different definitions of tree clearance in the two organizations. The Army Corps, one says pull the stumps, the other one says cut them off. And then you end up with the trees growing back, the shrubs and all the garbage there.
Currently Army Corps would consider an impact of pulling out the stumps and the root systems. So there is the root system to consider as part of that. We have been consistent with advising to cut it down and treat it chemically. so that it doesn't grow back.
I have a different question.
Go ahead.
Sort of. We're talking about exempting the fees, which is fine and seems reasonable to do, but I'd ask Adam if, to not charge a fee for these things, how does that run in conflict with the idea that our departments are supposed to be covering themselves for the time and efforts of our water
Yeah.
person?
It runs in direct conflict.
Okay.
But we also recognize that it's a tough subject area. I mean, there's a couple different things at play. I mean, you talked about the drainage districts, the agricultural communities. These are two of the beneficiaries that having a little bit more liberty in doing what they, in their eyes need to do, this would benefit them from. But then it would be a tremendous amount of staff time because every one of them would really be case by case as we look at this. So it would, and there is no fee for it. So that is a factor. The way we're looking at this is we're trying to kind of solve an issue that is there. And maybe in the long term, 10 years from now, we're gonna look back and say, that was nuts, that we even considered that. But it's been an issue for several years.
Okay, so the idea of not putting obstructions in front of these as a fee may or may not, we'd sort of eat that staff time just to help these type of things get moved along.
Yeah, at least that's what we're looking at right now. We're looking at that, hey, this is something we can do. And maybe we'll be back in here, come January and say, this is something we can't do.
Okay.
But we don't forecast that either, right? We want to have those conversations. It's very similar when we were talking about, recall going back a year on a completely different subject, but SWCD, having those conversations and wanted to really kind of focus on it. This would be similar or an expansion of that.
Okay. Well, if you're okay with it, I'm okay with it because you're the one that's going to come to us with the budget at the end of the year.
Yeah, right. Yeah, say that was I supported that wrong.
Okay.
I do want to add, there was a board resolution we have a general permit one for fencing in the floodplain. That one is a free permit that went through a resolution. So we already have one general permit that has no costs. Now, like I said, generally speaking, these are meant to be fairly fast and quick. And so we can take a look at that to say if it's not fast and quick for whatever reason and try to define it in those terms as well to see if, but just wanted to share that with you at least.
Yeah, I'll take Adam's opinion on that it's fine for right now for his budget. At the end of the year when he brings the budget forward to PED, and I'm sitting there looking at a deficit, he wants more money for stuff, then everybody's gonna look like, weren't you there when you did that?
We don't get a lot of dredging permits in currently. So it's not a huge number. I don't know that changing this language is going to all of a sudden, impact that at all. But anyone looking to do the work and considering it is just trying to provide.
Well, my opinion is that I agree with the TAC, as you summarized it a few minutes ago, and that's what we should move forward with.
I mean, they have to provide a site plan with the Army Corps.
If they feel like they're meeting the nationwide permit, they do not need to contact Army Corps at all.
So when I look at our Athena map, you can layer basically the historical flood zones and the FEMA flood zones. Is there another layer on here that could help people distinguish whether or not they are I guess, in a
Flood hazard.
floodplain, and, you know, only people within floodplains need to get this. Most
Right.
people can pull this up and look at a map and throw that out there.
Generally speaking, rule of thumb is if you're using the maps and you're outside of those hatched areas, the blue and the greenish, you're probably okay. The issue is with the floodplain mapping, if it has a known designation, the limits on the map might not be accurate. And so you'd have to take those elevations and figure out if they potentially drew it too tight and it should be further out, and that person is, you know, that's where that I spoke about, the technical aspect. The other thing that we look at for the historical is those historical maps are from a couple of floods in the mid-60s. With current development, the accuracy of those may not be appropriate anymore, to where we are better off looking at how the development has changed and the topography has changed, and potential more up-to-date, you know, permits from subdivisions that have potentially analyzed that. But to your point, rule of thumb, generally, if you're outside of those areas, you're probably okay with those two rare exceptions, with the one rare exception of the elevation and the mapping being incorrect. And so, you know, because technically, most of the time, if you're gonna be doing dredging, whether you consider it a drainage ditch or not, you're probably in a flood hazard area, but it might not be mapped floodplain. So, and the difference there is that FEMA just hasn't done a study on it, but doesn't mean that that's not a potential flood hazard area. So. And the intent here wasn't to have you guys, you know, obviously with some of this technicals, it was just more so to indicate that the TAC had a bit of a preference, but it felt better to kind of give you those options and see where the committee was at. And I can take it back to TAC if you guys want. We can try to, you know, see how each member felt. I know Larry, you know, it seems like you prefer to keep the permitting or have some kind of process where we get a site plan in place that it's at least checked. So with that in mind, we can take a look at that as kind of the core and figure out what we can do, how we can revise it, or maybe just come up with a way where maybe someone brings in their site plan to us, we can review it, give them a stamp, we can document it, and then it's not really a permit to minimize staff time. It would be no different than if someone comes to the counter and asks that question anyway. Hey, I'm thinking about doing some dredging on my property. Do you think I need a permit? We would have that normal conversation as part of our day-to-day operations.
Does staff have a recommendation?
Staff would prefer to have some kind of involvement to be able to provide feedback relative to a site plan. We are concerned that potentially that spoil material, if it's not properly handled, we're not aware of a project. If they say they're gonna do dredging, but they straighten the channel, obviously aerials will help show that, but just in general, having some of that, and knowing that neighbors are becoming more educated on stormwater, and we do get more phone calls and things like that, and providing them some assurance as well that, you know, we did have someone come in, we looked at it, type of thing. We don't, you know, the Army Corps and IDNR have gone to the full hands-off approach. We don't necessarily, staff doesn't feel like we want to go to that extreme.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna push it back one more time though. That's my feeling. I think that's kind of a split consensus here. I'd rather we push that back and get more definitions here. I don't want to put permits where we're currently not permitting. That's my concern.
Yeah,
And now we're increasing it rather than decreasing it. I'd rather they discuss that and split their definitions of what they want to do here.
We have, anytime there has been dredging in flood hazard areas, we have been issuing permits.
It seems like dredging, that's what we keep talking about, so if we just took dredging out of the maintenance, like you just said, you require it for a permit for dredging, so you guys care if they're dredging, but does staff have a major concern of people just, like we've been talking about, pulling dead branches out of drainage?
I think it depends how they're doing it and the level of vegetation. I mean, if it's a large tree that's fallen in, that's gonna cause potential soil erosion concerns, et cetera, and, you know, that's not quote-unquote dredging, and it's a maintenance activity. If it's not done properly, then it could cause an impact to somebody else type of thing. So it's really a gray area, where I'll throw it back to TAC, but in my mind, it's hard to separate dredging from the idea of removing vegetation, because in essence, you're probably gonna have some kind of debris that comes off of that vegetation unless you're just taking it down and cutting it at, you know, the stump level, if there even is a stump, but, in a lot of these, it is the sediment. I do wanna, you know, specify that it is the sediment that's usually getting into the ditches that does need to be removed. And if you're doing that, you're naturally gonna remove any vegetation that has grown in there with it.
Okay, so let's push it back one more time. I'd rather handle it, but let's push it back, get some clearings.
Okay.
I want to make one comment about the like a beaver dam and all that, or trees falling into the creek and everything. I'm going to give you an example of what kind of brought me into the confusion of this originally. Down the road from me, I think it was behind Boderman Estates or whatever, back in there on their flood pond or their retention ponds were filling up, and they thought somebody was blocking the creek. Joanna and what's the name, they went back there and they looked at it, and it's a beaver dam. Well, they said it was debris, and they showed me pictures of it and everything. And they said, they gotta get a permit to take that out. They go and take it out by hand if they want. And do we still have that definition or thought? Why can't you take a beaver dam out as a maintenance to pull that thing out of there? Because it was a beaver dam, because there's sticks up that are chewed up and they're falling in, you know, stuff falling in. But if they bring in a backhoe to tear that out, they had to get a permit for it. That's what they told them.
I would say no to remove it, but I think it just depends on that removal process, right? And that's something where if a backhoe is needed, then that's the machine that you need to remove that out of there. But
Right.
I would be of the opinion that if you're talking about something like that versus someone, that I would say no in my mind, but if someone's like, I have this 2,000-foot long ditch that I want to clean out. You know, clean out,
Right.
there's a lot of variability there, and without understanding what it looks like, is it going to be a full-on dredging process where you're producing spoil materials and you're going to be respreading those and everything, and is there going to be dead vegetation that you can just remove with the hand? Yes.
I just wanted to clarify that we're not telling people you gotta get a permit to clear that out still. Because I was like, that's nuts.
Definition I exempts removal of any obstruction from a channel. Any obstruction would include a beaver dam.
They weren't acknowledging that. That was the two bosses at the time. We have new bosses right now.
So, I mean, it goes back to your points that maybe the sticking point is the word dredging. And so we can take a look at that.
Okay. All right, so let's send it back one more time for them. I'm gonna make sure I'm at that meeting. Anybody else, if you could attend to that meeting, I'd appreciate it. So, I don't wanna be too particular, but I'm trying to be a little bit on this. I wanna make sure we get it right. Instead of having it go on again for 10 years. Okay, next discussion, long-term maintenance, best management practices and enforcement.
So this is related to our revisions that we were looking at for water quality, requiring best management practices based on the activity that occurs on the property and the potential pollutants. And just in general for things like stormwater detention basins and subdivisions and those type of components. The TAC was looking at how do we enforce long-term maintenance of these facilities. And staff's idea is that with some of the new language that you guys looked at previously, we want to try to have some kind of system available to accurately have the owner show that they are keeping up maintenance with their detention basin or rain garden or whatever it is for the purpose of handling a certain pollutant that was identified as part of their development. And the concerns that were brought up was that because for unincorporated areas specifically, the idea of having the county go in to do any lack of maintenance is not a favorable one. But if there's an owner that potentially is not maintaining their best management practice and now it is causing a potential issue, how can we have a good approach to long-term maintenance? And our thought process was what we're looking forward to with our watershed planning ideas to have these in a GIS-based system where we can annually reach out to the owners, have a set of criteria, and have them fill out and provide some pictures that they are keeping up with the maintenance tasks. And that but the question then comes into, well, if they are not, what do we do? Part of the TAC and some of the municipalities, they talked about the idea of an SSA, which is basically a system where that would get funded and the maintenance would be completed by somebody else. Now, typically in the municipalities, it is the village that is stepping in. They're hiring a third party or potentially doing the maintenance themselves. But that was the split again between the use of the SSA or having it become a violation where you did not perform your responsible duties for the maintenance criteria, and what is the incentive to get those folks to, again, perform that maintenance. So that's the general idea, and we can get into some more details, but I had indicated to TAC that I don't think the committee is going to be on board with having any type of ideas of having the county to go in and perform maintenance on private properties. That's going to be a non-starter.
So I'll throw out, because Crystal Lake does that.
Sure.
So in the Crystal Lake watershed, it's required that if you're basically anybody except for existing residential, so schools, churches, businesses, so if you expand in the Crystal Lake watershed, you have to sign a maintenance agreement with us. We plat on there the basin or the rain gardens or anything that they have. We plat it on there so that we have the legal authority to go on there. We also have a third-party consultant that we've had on board. This went into effect in 2007. So we have a consultant that we hire. That consultant actually 3 times a year or 2 times a year, depending on if it's a rain garden versus a very large basin, goes on site, completes the inspections. They do some routine maintenance, like riprap has fallen down, they'll put it back. Every year, the property owner is required to pay us a lump sum to cover the consultant going out there. So we've been lucky to have hay for the entire time we've done it, so, they are very cost effective in my opinion. We actually just renewed their contract, so their fees did go up a little bit. Based on what you have on your property depends, determines how much money you have to give. If it's like a rain garden, something simple, it's $500 a year, upwards of, we have some people that have very large basins, the college is also included in this. They're upwards of like $2,000, $3,000 a year. In my personal opinion, because I manage the program and have, every year it gets a little more challenging to get these people to give me the deposit. I actually just sent them out last month and I don't even know if I've gotten any deposits yet. So I'm kind of in that position right now of, okay, do I issue them a ticket if they don't pay me back, that kind of thing. From a staff perspective, it is a headache to maintain. From a maintenance perspective and making sure that these basins are maintained, it's good because he's gone out there. There's a couple facilities where they've had over invasive weeds and they've gone through, to get rid of those, where if you didn't have this consultant going out there, is trying to figure out how to keep that basin or whatever maintained. So it's kind of a catch-22 in my opinion, trying to do it. I know when the Crystal Lake brought forward, including the Crystal Lake watershed in the county ordinance back in the day, the county included a lot of our ordinance, but didn't put in that part about, them having to get that third party. So that's how we've been doing it. I don't have a better solution right now, but I would love to hear what other people are what the TAC would think or what you guys would think to see if maybe I do want to bring forward some different kind of change.
How are the other municipalities handling it?
We're similar to Crystal Lake. We do require SSAs to be formed during the development process, so that if they do fall short on their maintenance, we hire a third party to go out there and do the maintenance, and then we can charge the property owner. The village typically does not go in. We can in emergency situations, but we would prefer to have an insured third party.
And ours is only for properties in the watershed. So anybody outside the watershed.
See, ours are for all development.
Yeah, so we have that differentiation between the two. So if you're outside the watershed, we do put an easement over top of it, and then if you don't maintain it, then we have the right to go in and maintain it. But to be honest, I don't know if people are necessarily maintaining it. We don't have the staff or the time to kind of go check everybody, to be honest. So
a lot of our subdivisions, the homeowner association is responsible for that, and then they eventually go away.
we have that problem too.
And so then all these common areas that fall within the homeowner association fail to get maintained, and that's when we would enact an SSA. Now, I will tell you, we have 12 of them in town, and we have not yet to enact one. And some are pretty close, right on the edge. But, when the residents call and say, hey, how come the city's not maintaining this detention area? We explain to them what's happening, and we're gonna enact this SSA, and then all of a sudden, there's a maintenance crew out there, pulling sticks and stuff out of the outfalls and stuff, so.
Okay,
Yeah, Huntley's pretty much the same way. We've got subdivisions with the backup SSAs, but there are a couple that have active SSAs, so we're charging the property taxes to maintain those, and Public Works goes out there and takes care of those basins and any maintenance required with the bubblers and everything associated with that.
same way, okay.
That was a lot of the feedback from TAC. But we the concern is that the HOAs do go defunct. We do get calls from time to time. I just had one lady, complaining about the current status of the pond, and asking us to ask the HOA to maintain it. So it does come up, but that was the main points brought up.
She part of the HOA and she was asking us to go to her HOA?
Yes, because they were not listening to her.
Okay.
Part of the problem is, right, if over time, these subdivisions, especially the ones out in the county itself, that are part of the municipality, as the homeowners change over the 30, 40 years, nobody comes in, they want to do it. They don't want to pay the money in.
Well, the only people that are affected are the people that live around the pond. ponds, right? The 85% of subdivision that doesn't live around the ponds, they don't see it and they don't think it's an issue, so they don't wanna put any money into it.
Right.
And then for us, if there isn't an HOA, the owner that's directly on that property, nobody else wants to pitch in to help them out. Is the other, is kind of pointed out. So, but we're hoping at least with the watershed plans, when we establish those, that there will be an organic effort to establish watershed groups to kind of help discuss these issues and, make them more amenable to people in their mind that, potentially they should be looking to help out their neighbors and things like that, but at this point, we don't have anything, so, and I should clarify that currently, we do require a maintenance plan, like if a subdivision or a commercial development, this really does exclude small properties, or not small properties, but residential properties and smaller projects and things like that. They're not gonna be lumped into this idea of, it's only if you need the BMP. And for the ag community, if you're already using conservation practices or following NRCS standards and things like that, we're not gonna require you to do a BMP. So really, this is just an idea that it's gonna come down to also the developer and their design. We're not saying you have to do a BMP, but depending on how you do your design, you might need one, type of thing. So it's not, it doesn't just come down to us, but that would exclude that portion of owners from this.
So while they're developing, they're all bonded for the most part. We require bonds,
Well, we don't require a bond, but the maintenance plan would be approved if they're proposing an detention basin. We do record that, so that is a recorded document. But once we close out the permit and someone's like, hey, they're not maintaining their maintenance, my best advice to them is, well, it's a recorded document. If they're not keeping up that end of the bargain, then potentially you can go to Illinois drainage law to say that it's creating some kind of impact or nuisance and talk to an attorney to see if that's enough. But I don't, that's kind of the best I can offer to them without, stepping into any legal minefield myself or trying to offer legal advice. Is just, yes, they have a maintenance plan, it's recorded, you can get a copy of that if you want to talk to that property owner and try to convince them, but we don't have an ability, the ordinance isn't set up in a way to go back and do an assessment to say that they're not maintaining it, but it is a common problem, and you just heard the municipalities obviously are dealing with it too. They have their own method of dealing with it. So again, not trying to have you guys make a decision, but just trying to put it out there and see what the feedback is, to send it back to TAC.
Anybody have any opinion here on this end?
I don't have any better solution for that type of situation other than what the villages are doing or the cities are doing. I mean, I don't know where else to go with it.
It's an ongoing issue, and there hasn't been a fix yet that I've seen that works. It's
Well,
just,
how you fix it, that's the problem.
it's a mess.
With the residential subdivisions, there is that funding mechanism with the SSAs. It's what about the private developments, the large big box retailers, the commercial subdivisions? How do you get them as one owner that really wouldn't have an SSA? How do you get them to maintain their detention basins, their BMPs?
We still do SSAs on those.
You do?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even though it's one owner, they're still responsible for it. If they walk away from it, we enact that SSA. Okay. Our big issue is the older subdivisions, and I think that's the same with the county, like where we don't have the ability to enact an SSA. And they've walked away from associations. Those are our big issues. Our current subdivisions within the last 15 years all have SSAs. So.
We have the same thing. It's the older ones.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's platted that the poor property owner's in charge of the basin.
Yes.
So then you feel horrible for them too, where it's like two property owners.
Yep.
Or the storm sewer is failing, and then you read the plat and it's either does specifically say the poor property owner has to fix it, or it's vague. I've run into that too, where it's very vague, and then I had these two property owners like, I had the HOA actually and a property owner fighting over a very vague language from the 80s. They took it to court and I mean, it was a mess. So, and then we had people come and I mean, I had one problem years ago and our attorney said, well, we can lien every single house, but who wants to do that just to fix the base? And the problem kind of went away on its own. I think the homeowner realized, okay, the city's not gonna lien every property in the subdivision to maintain. Yeah, it's a constant mess. I wish someone could find some great solution. I haven't come up with one.
You learn what not to do when you're doing these development agreements.
100%. We fixed it moving forward. Yes. Yes. The future us will not have hopefully as much of a problem as we do. Hopefully.
So what do you want to do
Sure,
with
this
this?
goes down.
Well, I guess I wanted to more know from the committee members on whether or not you want us to look at an idea for some type of funding if it's not done, to look at having some kind of mechanism that someone can be hired to go and do the maintenance. I think that was the big question for.
I saw Larry's look.
Yeah, I think we should have something in place. My thought might be is that would the state's attorney have an opinion on this and what legal actions we could take or should take, and that would be enforceable from his point of view, and without getting us in trouble.
Well, I mean, if we wanted to revise the SMO, for example, and we can show that someone isn't maintaining their property based on, and again, we want to make it simple for these guys. A lot of the maintenance is straightforward, so having that process of them submitting information to us and having it reviewed, we can set that up and flag the ones that are an issue and cite them for a potential violation and say, you have to maintain it. And then the outset of that is if they haven't, then there could be a fine assessed. So that's currently like the way anything else in the SMO is, if you're not doing something, then you potentially get assessed with a fine.
Who's the fine gonna go to?
Well, the fine will go to the property owner that they're not maintaining it. So they've been found, so it would be an ordinance violation, so we go to OV court. We would present our case that it hasn't been maintained, and then if they decide, okay, I'll maintain it, provide the evidence, then, then that's fine. Otherwise, they could be found guilty, and then we would assess a fine to that owner.
Or if it's a residential subdivision, maybe do the SSA.
Well, yeah, so
Yeah,
the
something like that.
subdivisions, we
Yeah,
haven't
I
had
guess I was
any new
thinking of
ones.
subdivisions.
So the subdivisions, the idea behind the subdivisions is to have something in place so that the HOA has incentive to not dissolve, which would be more along the SSA type idea.
Again, the only issue is your existing subdivisions. Moving forward, you can handle that.
Moving forward,
because
yes.
You'll never establish an SSA in an existing subdivision.
Correct, so those are gonna have to be kind of
51%.
pre-existing entities that, as we develop our watershed plans, maybe we start to do more outreach and things like that. And we find that maybe these communities wanna set some kind of organization or group up, a watershed group where they collectively look at maintaining these, and similar to a drainage district, but for other components, if you will.
Which is very difficult, we found that out, getting those going and then getting them to do anything once we do activate.
Yeah. So, but that's kind of the thought, and I was thinking that it would be more of an ordinance violation. Language-wise, I thought the board members would be more amenable to that. It would work in the same way that the SMO already works, and there would just be a fine assessed to that owner, and if they continue to not maintain it, then potentially that fine can increase. And so now there is incentive for them to maintain it because they're getting fined for it, essentially. And this would be for newer projects going in once we get, obviously the SMO is amended. And this BMP language is a change from what we have currently as well.
Okay,
So that was my final 2 cents on it, I suppose.
Tracy, did you have a thought? I can see you sitting there thinking here.
Yeah, my wheels are spinning, just because I've had a lot of phone calls on beaver dam issues. You know, property owner lets the beavers, you know, but that's just an issue where, do you side with beavers or do you side with the landowner who is being flooded out upstream because this beaver has built the dam in a potential waterway? So that's a tough one. I mean, would something like this just really be for developments?
This is specifically for a development coming in that would propose some type of detention basin or infiltration or rain garden or some type of B&P that is specific to a potential pollutant that they could be dealing with. So one example could be some type of outdoor storage landscaping facility. You know, they could throw a roof over their material, for example. If it's uncovered, then maybe they want a buffer. And they need to make sure that they maintain that buffer. And that could just be a visual inspection to make sure that the vegetation is in place. And if we find that, you know, all of a sudden it's dirt and there's no vegetation, then that would be a clear, hey, you're not maintaining your buffer, and when it rains, you're receiving material from, you know, maybe even outside of the county, we don't know what's in there. This buffer is dealing with that sediment issue and maybe other pollutants. So just to give you kind of a real example that you're dealing with. So then we would know that that buffer area is there. We would have it in our system. We're looking to go to a system that DOT uses to track their infrastructure and components. And we would have a way to have an annual automation to go out to the owner and say, hey, this is your checkup. Or maybe in that case, it's a quarterly checkup, or in the spring and the fall type of thing, to make sure that that buffer is still healthy. So this wouldn't apply to those type of situations.
What type of staff would you need to implement something like that?
Well, this relates also to our MS4 permitting that is going to require us to track this. So the idea is, once we're able to get it into a GIS system, it would just be an ongoing basis of just inputting that information in there. And there is a technology that DOT uses that other municipalities have started using to track their infrastructure or their open spaces or whatever they might have. Basically run a report, see where they're at. They can draw work orders from it or whatever. They can communicate. There's ways to communicate with those owners as long as we have the information, and they could electronically submit that information. We can create a field for that buffer. You know, there's certain things that need to be done, and so the owner would indicate that they're either doing it and have, you know, attach a picture to show that, or if we haven't seen anything, then that could be a potential inspection. So there's probably an upfront kind of staffing. It's going to take longer to get all this into the system, but theoretically, once it's in there, then it should be easier to maintain that information. So.
Okay. All right, let's move on then.
Okay. I'll take that back to the TAC with exploring those two ideas and have something more concrete for you guys then.
Right.
Okay.
Early watershed planning outline.
So, real quick, I included our outline. I don't know if I did this with you guys previously, but this is our comp plan. So the table of contents, this is a moving concept. So chapter 1 and chapter 2 are pretty straightforward. It's chapter 3 that we start getting into the idea of the watershed planning and what are the different things that go with that. How do we get there? And so this is a kind of overview of that breakdown as we get into these ideas. And so we do want to break it up with this idea of the transitioning portion, what that means, what that's going to look like. And then chapter 4 would be a breakdown of all the information we've been able to ascertain from these watersheds, with chapter 5 as an action plan and chapter 6 is tracking. So the idea is this would be written after we're able to do our watershed studies. So the watershed studies are baked into this comp plan, with tracking on a 10-year cycle. So we would like to see these updated on a 10-year cycle. But we do have items in here, for example, outreach, and we're hoping that some of the outreach, again, is kind of a grassroots effort. We think that at a minimum for these watersheds, there probably is going to need to be a watershed group that's established, that we can provide the technical assistance to. We wouldn't run it, but these, this group would meet, or maybe multiple sub-watersheds. These groups would meet because what we're offering to do here is develop a list of projects for the ability to get funding that would be as close to shovel-ready as can be, and each project would vary on what that means. And then the communities, if there's a funding opportunity, these watershed groups would discuss amongst themselves to potentially place priority on which projects they'd like to see move forward. So it's a lot of information, but just an opportunity to have you guys actually see it, read through it, and if you have any questions or comments, concerns, the idea is I'll try to present this every so often as we start to make more progress, with the idea that we're going to get into details on a lot of these tasks and start putting dollar amounts to them. This is the attempt is going to be to get grant funding for this, with the cost share coming from potentially the county, but then also the municipalities that show interest, that want to participate, or any other organizations that are a stakeholder that would have interest.
So a grant to get the plan written, to start with.
Plan written, and then basically all of chapter 3. So the studies, the outreach, the analysis, all of that would go through grant funding as well.
Looks like a good approach to me.
I do want to say the majority of these grants that we are looking at, there is a 25% match. So that 25% would be supplemented by our communities or stakeholders that want to have an investment. If they don't provide that investment, then we would potentially, in our action plan, have that as a future goal to get them incorporated. But the idea would be that we want to work with those communities, develop certain projects, infrastructure. So some, along the lines of what was discussed, is there a particular ditch that's a maintenance issue that would be better off restored, that would lower maintenance costs, whether it's in a drainage district or not, that would help with flooding? Do we have beavers that are running around and causing flooding issues in a certain neighborhood and area? How do we want to tackle that? Obviously, the beavers are going to keep coming back, so can we find a solution to work with them? Those are the type of things we would be offering to these communities if they, want to participate and come in and, establish a group. Because once we have the projects ready, we don't want to be responsible for telling them, here's the projects we think you should do first. We want that to come from the communities that are involved as part of that process.
Okay. Anybody have any comments? Off the subject just a little bit, when we're talking about beaver, you keep bringing up, I want to ask how the municipalities handle the beaver dams. Huntley's had some down in the creek down there, I've seen.
I know nothing.
I was gonna say the same thing.
Well, you tore them, but they disappeared, so somebody tore them.
Public Works sometimes does it.
Okay.
It all depends on who actually owns the land. I've had experience when I worked for Kane County, there was a beaver dam and the property owners did not want it touched. And it was causing severe flooding upstream in a subdivision. And there's nothing that can be done. Legally, it's an act of God. Mother Nature wants the beaver there, and the homeowner said, we like it. So they could not touch it.
It's called Christie No.
Poor beaver.
I know Ernest with McDOT just worked with MCCD in a particular area where they have a beaver issue. They're looking at implementing a newer design that allows the water to flow, but keeps the beaver happy. I don't know the details of that, but I think they just recently installed it. So that could be something where potentially they're getting good data and shows that it works for a potential solution to it. But MCCD and DOT have a project currently ongoing that maybe we can share at a future meeting. Or provide the information, I can email it out to share.
Got a question on the watershed planning thing. That do you have any timeline that you're thinking this is going to develop through?
So we're hoping to get the details sorted by next April, May, with activities listed out, dollar amounts listed out, bring this forward. Obviously, it's got to go through all the committees, county board approval, and things like that. The grant process usually starts after July for a lot of the grants. So that would kick us into next year, let's say, if we're ready to apply. We wouldn't know until probably after October, with a lot of these getting worked out kind of the following April or May. And then the actual work that goes into it would probably be about 3 years, with all the outreach and education and everything. And there is a caveat with 4 watersheds. If we're gonna get a grant, usually they're a 4-year grant, so we'd have to run these 4 watershed studies concurrently. So from a management perspective, that is gonna be tough, but that's why we wanna develop a clear blueprint that everyone is following, so there is a consistent guideline. So we're hoping that what happens if potentially one watershed is running into an issue, we have the other 3 that maybe have faced that and can have that communication, and hope that, you know, allows us to move forward with each one. But after each one is done, then it's going to be compiling it all and then moving it over to somebody to help us write it. Okay. And then that will be a living, breathing document from there, and we're hoping that that will help facilitate future discussion on SMO changes, the outcomes of those.
Okay.
That's kind of the timeline, is probably from, to get to the actual, through the actual grant process, probably into next year if we're able to get it. So that would be 2020, so maybe mid-2026. So if you're looking at a 3-year period to actually get all the work done, you're looking at potentially 2029 with the writing process. That'll probably take about a year. So, but it's something new. No one's really done what we're doing. We're getting a lot of great feedback from virtually everyone that is involved, from folks like the IEPA, who would be reviewing our plans and approving it to as part of grant funding that they have available. We're going to be looking to meet their standards. We're going to be looking to meet, you know, as much of other components that we can, that would then open us up to additional grant funding that would be able to fund these individual projects in these communities.
Good.
All right. Anybody else? Anybody with any future topics? I think we gave Story quite a bit to bring back.
It was expected, and you know, I apologize, the nature of some of this was a little bit vague. I didn't have clear direction for you guys, but some of these ideas are not easy to deal with.
Right.
So I wanted to gauge where you guys were at or not, or keep moving forward, so that was the idea behind it, was get some early feedback, or at least make you aware of where we were headed. To make sure like, whoa, Stoyan, let's rethink that one, but since I didn't get that, I guess that's a good thing, because that's kind of what I was expecting, but hopefully I'll have more for you guys.
So we don't end up like we did last time. We have the tech, half of the tech committee is gonna be up this November.
Yeah, I think December officially.
So do we want to set that in our September meeting to interview?
Yeah, that's a great point. And
Rather do that 6 months after they're gone.
yes, yeah. And we'll work with getting another round of messaging out and with
Now that they're
Alicia.
meeting regularly, it shouldn't have any trouble with people
Yeah,
knowing who wants to do it, who doesn't.
so, and I'll send out a little blurb to everybody here, so if you know folks that might be interested, we can
Okay,
make it as inclusive as possible.
all right,
I'm good.
all right, if that's all, motion to adjourn, Carl Kaminsky. Scott Hayek?
Hey, Jack.
Hey, Jack. See, I'm good for a while. All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Sure, thanks, guys. And gals. Yeah. All right. Rolling up on me while I'm sitting here.